Hello, fabulous friends, fans, and superstars. Welcome to Synchronicity Web TV. I am your host, Nadiya Shah, and this is your moment of synchronicity. Well, I'm so excited today to celebrate with you my friend, Lara Van Zuydam. Now, Lara is amazing. She's brilliant. She's a mystic. She's an astrologer. She's a lawyer. So she's got that mix of being kind of a nerd like me, but also being very connected to spirit as well. Well, I have known her for a while. I have been so proud of the way that she's just been blowing up all over the astrology world lately with all these wonderful opportunities. So of course I had to invite her to teach at Synchronicity University as well. Now, Lara is going to teach on Esoteric Astrology as part of the March 2022 speaker series at Synchronicity University. And of course, the very famous Choose Your Tuition rate is on now till the end of February 2022 only, as low as just $5 a class, which is an unheard of rate to learn from this caliber of teacher. And of course, Lara, you're about to see, is truly that brilliant. So Lara, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Nadiya. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an absolute privilege and thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm so thrilled to have you as well, because I know you are so much like me in that you have that side of you that's academic, and I like to call it the nerdy side, right? Like, you know, and you're connected to the history, but then you also have this love for the experience of spirituality itself. And so let's actually start there. How do you feel like the two get along within you? Do you reconcile the two? Like, how does that work for you personally?
It's a very good question, and true to how you've just described me, I could really get into the detail. I'll try to avoid too much of that, but I will say that my life path has been very diverse in that respect. There's been that slight dichotomy. So on the one hand, I've had this more orthodox kind of career in law, which I continue to maintain, where I've had to learn to really grapple with the detail and dig into the weeds of things, which is helpful when it comes to astrology. But it's very left brain logic focused. And then on the other side, I've had my creativity, I've had my spirituality, which has always been really important to me. And I think the two do mesh. It's just how you approach each one of those categories and what's appropriate in the various circumstances.
Yeah, some people are able to find that balance more readily than others. I have met people over the years who have that, I call nerdy side, let's call it the academic side, and they struggle to find the right balance between the mystical, spiritual experience that we feel called to, but also needing to ground that in, as you said, the details, right? The more intellectual pursuits as well, the healthy detachment that sometimes academia asks of us. And so it's great that you've been sort of able to find that right balance. And it really does show up in your teaching, because I've had the chance to see you teach, because you've had so many opportunities as of late. And in your teaching, you're able to bring in that history, bring in that side that understands the details and the nuances, but also take this intuitive approach to your teaching as well, being responsive to the students. And it's really lovely to see.
Thank you. One of the things that's really important to me is being able to take quite a complex, abstract subject such as esoteric astrology and to try to make it more accessible by looking at its structure and looking at what I can draw together to make it more accessible.
That's amazing. So that's a great segue, because I know that you will be teaching your class on esoteric astrology. So can you tell us, what is esoteric astrology? Define it for us.
So I would just define esoteric astrology, certainly the esoteric astrology that I practice, as originating from Alice Bailey's work dating back to the 30s. But I like to think I bring a contemporary sort of twist to that and interpret it for the modern times. And what it's about essentially is a far more soul-focused approach to interpreting charts. Now, we all have different philosophical outlooks, and we have to take that into account. But we also need to consider the fact that we have a variety of different clients as astrologers. Now, we may get some clients who are particularly interested in soul and who do believe that we are more than just these bodies, and that ultimately we are here to grow. And in fact, we will reincarnate until we've reached the point where in our spiritual development, where we're ready to move into spirit. And that gets really into the complexities right from the get-go of the subject. But to summarize, I would say It is a way of looking at a chart, and it doesn't have to just be a birth chart, in which you look at the progress of the soul and what the challenges might be, what the skills might be, and how we can leverage this lifetime and make the most of what we have.
And so I know, because I read Esoteric Astrology by Alan Leo, and I've certainly been inspired by Alan Leo's work a lot. And so from what I understand, Alan Leo was Alice Bailey's student, right?
I think that's correct. Although, full transparency, I must admit I'm quite biased towards Alice Bailey, and I focus most of my intentions and attentions on her.
That's amazing. Look, I love it. I love that we come from so many incredible ancestors as astrologers. We have these wonderful ancestors. I certainly consider Alice Bailey and Alan Leo part of our ancestors as well. So you mentioned that esoteric astrology has a very soul focus, the soul evolution. And isn't it also rooted in an understanding of past lives as well?
That's correct. So that's certainly part of it. And you can certainly look at the chart and interpret the chart in that way and use those techniques, because you would look, for example, at the sun and what the sort of cumulative effect of what I will loosely describe as karma. And when I speak of karma, I'm not talking about punishment. I'm talking about the universal law of cause and effect, and how that manifests in the lifetime, primarily by reference to the sun. Bearing in mind that this is an esoteric astrology interpretation, there are different astrologers who see the sun in different ways. But what I would also add is that this particular technique that I use in esoteric astrology, I've begun to incorporate in some readings that I do for clients, is just one way in which one can read the soul into a natal chart. Of course, there are many different ways, dating back to the Hellenistic astrologers and their techniques, for example, by looking at the helmsman. So the first house, the captain of the ship.
And so in that case, you're looking at the ascendant and you're looking at the first house.
You are. And then you will look at the ruler of the first house primarily and see where that is in the chart. So I bring that up because I would just want to emphasize that I'm not suggesting that esoteric astrology is the only method by which we can read the soul into a chart, but I have found it particularly helpful. And it's very spiritual.
Yes, and it is a specific system or school of astrology. And there's a lot of value in sort of exploring a particular viewpoint, a particular school, to really master yourself in a particular direction. I know that a lot of astrologers, we tend to be very inspired, and we draw on different traditions, different schools, different systems as part of our practice as a way forward. And my hope is that with this class, students are able to do that as well. For some, being introduced to esoteric astrology, particularly rooted in the lessons of Alice Bailey, and they may find inspiration, but I think some will likely find themselves very drawn to it, want to explore more of it, want to delve that much deeper into understanding the chart from the esoteric astrology perspective.
Absolutely. I think it's really important that we challenge ourselves, introduce ourselves to new concepts. And then once we have the information in front of us, we can, of course, decide what works best for us. At the very least, to decide, well, that was interesting, but maybe it's not for me. Or as you say, that's fantastic, that really resonates, and I'm going to use that going forward, not only on my clients, but potentially with respect to my own path.
So can we go back and just talk about the sun a little bit more? Can you discuss the sun in esoteric astrology? Because I know, like, for example, in psychological astrology, we talk about how the sun is where you find your light. What you feel makes you shine very brightly in this lifetime. Now, how does that differ from understanding the sun from an esoteric astrology perspective? Because you already did touch on it a little bit, but I think it would be great to hear more, to explore more as to what the sun means in esoteric astrology.
Absolutely. Now, the interesting thing is that I think one can draw links between the psychological version and the esoteric interpretation of the sun and its role. I don't think the two are entirely mutually exclusive, but the esoteric take on it is, broadly speaking, as I said before, that it's the accumulation of karma. So whatever you've done in your past lives, the idea is that that has brought you to your particular mode of operation in this particular lifetime. And it is described as the key to the personality ray in this lifetime. So essentially, it very much turns on personality, which I believe is the take from a more modern psychological astrology point of view.
And so when you talk about Re, do you mean the sun god of Egypt, Ra?
Good
question. Is that who you're talking about? Yeah.
No, it isn't, in short.
Awesome.
But it's a good segue to the next point, which is one of the major tenets of this particular practice is the idea, and this is where we get really deep into esoteria, so bear with me. The idea is that 7 rays filter down, and the Vedic astrologers also share this, and so did the Hellenistic astrologers. They were also of this mindset that rays are emitted from the constellations. They have an impact on the sun, and the sun in turn has an impact on the planets, which then emit energies which are transformative and therefore transform the earth. And from an esoteric astrology point of view, the idea is that we are transformed in accordance or consistent with divine will. And that's a whole discussion, a philosophical debate about whether we like it or not. But essentially, the personality ray is a separate consideration because it takes the view that in this particular lifetime, you might exclusively be working on your personality. And here's where we start going into these sort of conceptual frameworks about where we are in our development, and that I'll go into that in great detail in the class. But for some of us, we not only focus on our personality ray, but we also have that other awareness, the other side, which is an awareness of the immortal being that lives within the human body, the so-called tireless watcher. And so I wanted to draw the distinction on the one hand between the personality ray, where we face challenges in day-to-day life, which are of perhaps a more mundane level, where we have to, and everyone goes through this at some point in many incarnations, working on the personality, becoming the best versions of themselves from a personality point of view. And then on the other hand, we have the soul and the growth of the soul as a different concept. So a very convoluted way of explaining it, but again, it's quite abstract. So I think it necessitated a bit of explanation.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. I love those abstract philosophical discussions. It makes my Sag moon sing, I have to say. But I thought about a couple of things. I know, right? You can imagine. But one thing that stood out to me while you were talking about this idea of rays, right? I was thinking back to Plato and his work Timaeus. And this is a book that is sort of a mystical understanding of the creation of the cosmos. And actually, one of my books, which is called The Body and the Cosmos, is I sort of use Timaeus as a jumping off point to connect his ideas to a astrological sky. So that's how nerdy I am that I actually would do that. But
completely endorse that.
Yes. And so in one of the ideas presented in Timaeus is this idea of vital chains, is what Plato describes them as. And it's this idea that their source, and then from source arises these chains and of different energies, of different, what we would call archetypes. And then come the planets. And from the planets, there are these vital chains that connect to every area of life. So for example, you mentioned the sun. So he talks about vital chains connecting the sun to lions here on earth, to dandelion flowers and so on, and gold. So all of these end up being connected. Now, I don't think he uses these specific examples, but we can see how his conceptualization of vital chains is so similar to what you just described using Ray.
That absolutely makes sense. And it's just another indication that often there are a number of different philosophical frameworks which use different methodologies, but ultimately we get to the same outcome.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I know Alice Bailey, when she said Re, she didn't mean the sun god Ra, the Egyptian sun god Ra, but there's something to be said for understanding how the sun has been understood, right? In mythology, how the sun has been anthropomorphized by us as human beings, and how now we take those energies so much more personally. It's like we take ownership for these energies being a part of us, for us being an exemplification of, at one time, was a very externalized sacred energy.
Absolutely. And the sun is important when we look at the chart from the esoteric astrology point of view for a number of reasons, but in particular, because it's one of the primary methods which we would utilize to make an assessment of where the individual is in terms of the conceptual frameworks that I referred to, whether they're just working on their personality in this lifetime, or whether they've begun to discover that they're more than just this body, or whether they've moved on to the initiate stage where they are nearing the completion of their existence on the endless cycle, endless wheel of birth and rebirth.
It's interesting to consider where somebody may be in that. And you're able to see that in the chart?
Partly in the chart, but also partly through, and I'm using the word interrogation advisedly, because obviously by interrogation, I mean gentle, subtle questioning, understanding where the client's coming from, what the particular query is, what particular challenges or crises they may be experiencing in this lifetime. And it sounds a bit melodramatic because frankly, that's what life is like. You know, of course we want to experience joy, and we do experience joy, but we also need to acknowledge, certainly from an esoteric astrology point of view, that we have to grapple with these challenges. And the idea is if we can develop awareness around, you know, those challenges in the chart, what we've been given to grapple with specifically in this lifetime, we can then cultivate a stronger sort of and more robust defense mechanism, or coping mechanism is probably a better way of putting it, to be able to take on those challenges, and we can grow through those instead of sort of going back to square one because we keep making the same mistakes, because the planets in the orthodox form in the chart keep playing out those patterns and we're not aware, and therefore we're falling into the same traps. But I will be going into those details to explain all of that in the class.
And so what do you do when a client says, when will I get married? Let's say a client comes to you and they ask you that question. What do you say?
Interesting
as an
question.
Esoteric astrologer, yeah.
As an esoteric astrologer, I'd probably first want to understand where they were coming from. I would want to understand whether they were on the personality, and I'm going to use the word cross, but I want to emphasize it does not necessarily have religious connotations. It's more about the cross of manifestation, which is very mystical. But I would want to understand whether they were working on personality, and it was truly about when am I going to get married. I'm not saying that anyone, you know, who wants to know when they get married isn't spiritual, but sometimes that may be more of a concern for those people. Or perhaps there's a good reason why they want to know if they're going to get married, because maybe they don't want to get married, or they're being pressurized into getting married, or they think it's part of their spiritual purpose. So that's the first thing I would look at. I would then employ some other techniques, some timing techniques. In fact, in particular, the Hellenistic Time Lord techniques, to give me better insights into that, rather than exclusively relying on esoteric astrology, because I would see that more in the domain of what's happening with this individual from a soul point of view right now, rather than using it as a timing technique, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I would probably look at the lot of Eros to go into the specifics of that and see whether there are any significant cycles coming up. And then I would hopefully give them an indication on when it might be likely. In fact, I had someone the other day who wanted to know when they were going to get into a significant relationship. And I said, well, look, something's going to kick off at this point. I said, don't hold me to that, because I'm not in the business of fortune telling, but I can say there are going to be significant shifts in that particular area. But I digress slightly, obviously outside of esoteric astrology.
Now, I love that you said that you are not in the business of fortune telling. I once had somebody introduce me to someone else as a fortune teller, and I felt so offended by that, I'll tell you. I couldn't really articulate in the moment why. I mean, this was many years ago. How do you understand the difference between an astrologer and a fortune teller?
Such brilliant questions, which I'm just loving. I think primarily the notion of a fortune teller is someone who can give a person predictions based purely on fate. And those predictions are expected to be completely accurate. Now, as astrologers, as I see it, we're giving an indication of the dynamics that are coming the client's way. And it's a similar issue when it comes to tarot reading, for example, I would argue. And we can give them indications of timing, specific cycles that are coming up by way of timing techniques. But ultimately, it really depends on one's philosophical framework. We're not in the business of, unfortunately, I think fortune tellers, for want of a better term, perhaps mediums and so forth, sometimes have attracted a bit of negative publicity. And mediums these days are very different. I think it's quite an archaic, obsolete term, this notion of fortune telling and sort of being held to ransom to make sure that we give these entirely accurate, very specific predictions. Whereas astrology is more about techniques that we can give the client and indications of cycles in the client's chart that we can give to them that will empower them to make the best possible decisions using their free will based on the notion that they have some say in the matter. Now, I will qualify that by just bringing in a little bit about my own philosophical framework. I would say that I'm a partial determinist and that I believe we come, and this goes to my esoteric astrology as well, I believe we come in with a particular purpose, with certain parameters in place. Am I going to, apply to enter Miss World at this point or ever in my life when I was much younger? No, it just wouldn't have worked for me. I've come in with very specific outcomes that I knew, pretty quickly about. But what I can do is within those parameters, I can exercise my free will and empower myself by hopefully learning from the difficulties that I've experienced and the challenges I've gone through, and then deciding that I'm going to have a go at something a little bit differently the next time round. So I think that's the difference between an astrologer. Again, it's quite a complex explanation, but in short, we're not in the business of giving exact predictions, looking into our crystal balls and telling the client that this is or isn't going to happen. There are certainly ethical considerations around that, amongst other things. But again, I'm a very mutable personality. So I would also say there might be occasions where something pops up and we do make an uncanny sort of recommendation or suggestion something has happened in the client's life and it turns out to be true. So it's sort of shades of those two broad camps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like astrology should be a tool to empower people, to help people become more aware of themselves, of their choices, of their own desires, so that they can make their choices more consciously. But I get it that there are certain cultures, for example, certain frameworks, for example, and certain systems of astrology as well that can be very predictive, that rely on this notion that everything is fated, a very fatalistic worldview. And I'm really grateful that I don't live in that kind of a paradigm. It's a privilege not to live in that paradigm, especially as a woman.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, when I think about the death predictions in particular, it's unbelievable that was a thing ever.
I know, right? And actually, there was this thing that was taking place sort of about 100 years ago among astrologers. I remember reading an article about this where they had this competition amongst themselves where they would go about trying to predict their own death. And so they would look at the chart and they would explain their rationale. And it was like this fun thing that astrologers were doing at the time. Well, guess what? Pretty much all of them died the way that they predicted, right? All of them. You can't be wrong. Yeah, if you're the astrologer and you're out there saying I'm right, then you don't want to be wrong where it comes to something like that. Yeah. I mean, ever since I was a little kid, I've been saying I want to live until I'm 150 years old. And I have lately been saying I would like to live to my Neptune return. Like, that's what I want. I just want to, I know, like, according to esoteric astrology, for example, our soul lives on, right? We are consistently learning lessons in this lifetime and we bring them into this lifetime and we'll carry them into next lifetime as well. But I always felt like it would be really cool to pack it all into one lifetime. Like, it's a matter of faith to know that I walked the pyramids of Egypt, but it'll be really cool when I can actually say in this lifetime, I remember walking the pyramids of Egypt. So that's something I'm looking forward to personally.
Likewise. In fact, it's on my to-do list. And for one reason or another, I've just not got there yet, but give me time as well. I couldn't agree more. And I think for me, my understanding is that when it's our time to go, when we've kind of done what we need to do, and as long as we have all these things that we need to do, and we're inspired and we know we've got to deliver outcomes, we need to continue to subsist.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lara, I love talking to you. You and me, we get our nerd hats on together and we have a lot of fun. I tell you, it's always so amazing to talk to you. And you guys remember, Lara is actually going to be teaching a class on esoteric astrology at Synchronicity University as part of the March 2022 speaker series. And if you sign up before the end of February 2022, you can actually choose your tuition rate as low as just $5 a class to learn from the brilliant Lara and others. Well, Lara, thank you so much for being here. I send you very big hugs.
Thanks, Nadiya. Really, really loved it and hope to speak to you soon.
Yes, and keep just shining bright and sharing. I'm so proud of you and all the moves that you've been making in astrology. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
And thank you, everybody out there, for watching. And until we connect again, take care. Bye.